So that when you are college educated and some institution has declared you graduated and a learned member of society, if you turn around and say, I choose not to believe this emergent scientific consensus, no, you don't have that option. It's not how objectively established scientific truths are determined. It is true whether or not you believe in it.
All right. Well, now that we've come to the 1900s and ultimately the 21st century, and we've looked at all of the false signs and wonders, false prophets, delusions, illusions, and so on, bad science, cover-ups, it's time to look at a few more final things in this journey. And that is, of course, relativity. And the next section after this will be quantum and quantum-related things like quantum mechanics, quantum computing, and all of these other lies from the devil. The enemy and the beast use relativity and quantum physics to basically obfuscate the truth, to make things very murky and confusing, and to ultimately hide all of the things that happened in the 1800s, those experiments that proved that the Earth was motionless, and hide the model of heliocentrism behind relativism. So we need to dive into these things and debunk them. That's what we're going to do today. Remember the quote by Martin Luther, 500 years ago, where he was addressing people. I don't know if he was addressing Copernicus specifically, but he was addressing this desire to change cosmology that was happening around that time, and the idea that the Earth was moving, it wasn't the sun that was moving. And he pretty much spelled it out very clearly. He said it's about as ridiculous as believing that you are in a cart, like a horse cart, and you're going along the road and it's actually the trees and the road that are moving underneath you. It's not the cart that's moving. And the funny thing is that was a prediction in a sense, probably obviously not something that he intended to predict, but he predicted relativity through that quote. It was very predictive, I should say, at least. I don't think he intended to predict it, but relativity is exactly that. That is the confounding and confusing and ridiculous gaslighting of relativity. That the idea that if you were in a horse-drawn cart and you're looking outside, it is equally true that it could be the trees and the road that is moving underneath you and you're standing still, not you moving over the road and watching the trees move by. In relativity, those two things are equal, and we're going to debunk that because it's nonsense. It's relativism. And there's a very satanic agenda behind these seemingly scientific things. And today, hopefully, you will realize that because we're going to debunk it. The next two sections, this one and the next one on quantum, are going to get it into a little science, but we'll make it understandable. We'll make it fun. It'll be like going back to school with fun. Obviously, going back to school, maybe not as a good memory for any of us, but it's going to be fun. It's kind of like going back to science class, but we're going to make it about the school of life, really, because the point is not so much that you understand all of these things. You don't need to understand everything in these sections. You really don't. So enter the following information with the expectation that I don't need to understand everything. You don't. I don't understand everything discussed in these videos. However, I want you to focus. I want you to focus because everybody has the ability to focus. I want you to focus because we're going to try to make it as understandable as possible so that you can see what they did to deceive people. Because what they did is actually very simple. It's the same usual Antichrist pattern throughout history. Take the truth, invert it, flip it upside down. Misdirect, cause confusion, lie, gaslight, and so on and so forth. These things you can see. Anybody can see that. You don't need to be a science PhD or a physics nerd to understand what they did. You don't need to understand relativity or quantum, the way quantum is supposedly working, because they don't work. They're nonsense. You don't need to understand the fullness of what we're talking about today. You just need to focus and slog through some of the things that maybe are over your head, because we're going to try to make it as simple as possible. And so you can see what they did and why all of these things are wrong. So whenever people cite to you relativity or quantum mechanics or all of these things that supposedly we've known for the last 100 years, you can say to them, that's baloney. It's sorcery, it's nonsense, it's gaslighting, and it's just the devil's attempt to destroy the biblical cosmology. So Einstein was a genius, but not in the way that people think he was. The 1800s and the early 1900s pretty much gave a death blow to heliocentrism with the things that we talked about in the past, like Michelson-Morley, Airy's experiments, Sagnac's experiments, and so on. So Einstein was propped up and brought relativity, the theory of relativity, to science by arguing that basically there's no absolute frame of rest. Now, what does that mean? When you are in that horse-drawn carriage and you're moving, you can tell that you're moving because you're comparing an at-rest Earth with motion, and you realize what is actually moving. It's not the Earth that's moving underneath your cart. It's your cart that's moving over the Earth. I mean, that sounds very obvious, right? But we're getting into some things that are going to confuse the waters like crazy. So you have to have an absolute frame of rest. Now, Einstein basically got rid of that with his theories on relativity. There's no absolute frame of rest. The reality, the truth, is that Earth is motionless. It is the absolute frame of rest, meaning you can always have a reference frame of what's moving because the Earth isn't moving. You know that when you throw a ball and you're playing catch, or let's say you're watching, father and a son play catch, and they're throwing a ball back and forth, and you're watching that. You know that the ball is moving because you have an absolute frame of rest. It's not, the Earth that's moving or whatever other crazy thing. There is an objective movement, an objective motionless frame. Einstein got rid of that. The truth is that the Earth is created to reflect God's glory. God is the rock throughout Scripture, the unchanging one, the foundation that we're standing on, basically, right? That keeps us alive. The Earth is designed to point you to that reality. The Earth is the rock, right? It's the underneath the foundation. It's motionless. It's infinite. It's a picture of the divine. So, without an absolute frame of rest, and again, God is the objective frame. He's the objective moral source. He's the one that tells you what is up and down and left and right. Same with the Earth. The Earth is objectively flat. There's an up, an objective up, and an objective down. And so on the globe, though, you don't have that. You have relativism. Up is relative. If you're on the North Pole, up is that way. If you're on the equator, up is west, according to the North Pole. So it's just nonsense. It's all relative. Relativism. There's no objective truth. And this is what Einstein's gift to science was through his bogus theories. So this is the problem. And these things are fundamentally antichrist because despite the science-y appearance, they're actually spiritual belief systems that are designed to destroy your mind and to hide the lie of heliocentrism. They hate God, so they have to get rid of the proof that there's an absolute frame of rest, which of course was proven in the 1800s through all those experiments that we cited. So they make everything relative to the observer. You can determine what is up or down. Of course, that should sound familiar to you because that is the forbidden fruit. Without an absolute frame of reference, you can always argue something that isn't true is true. And you'll understand what I mean by that. Because according to Einstein, both truths are true. The horse-drawn cart moving across the Earth is true, but the Earth also moving under the horse-drawn cart can equally be true, which of course is nonsense. Either one is true or the other one is true. You can't have both be true, but this is relativism and relativity. It's the all truths are true type of thinking, which is very common today as well. And of course, it destroyed all scientific inquiry and confused everybody for the rest of the journey. Notice that science is not immune to the forbidden fruit. You, according to Einstein, are the determiner of what is up or down, what is good or evil, right? God is not the standard. It's you that's the standard, that you determine reality, basically, what this is. And of course, without an absolute frame of rest, it defaults to the observer, mankind. You are the determiner of what is going left or right. Einstein also was a communist, and he was a Kabbalah-loving Jew, basically, that was a mystic, probably. Who knows how deeply involved he was? Who knows if he was actually a secret society member or a Jesuit or who knows what? It doesn't matter, folks. It really doesn't. But we know enough about his religious proclivities, about his experiences. Remember channeling and having trance-like states that he couldn't be disturbed and suddenly it comes to him. These things are very suspect, given also the fact that he wasn't a believer in the biblical God, that he was probably a communist because he was associated with all these other people. It's very likely that he was being puppeted by the devil one way or another. It's very likely. Just look at the fruits. By their fruits you shall know them. So Einstein was no hero. He was no scientist. He was just a very confused and deluded puppet that they used to confuse everybody else. And you'll see how all that played out today. There's no absolute authority that Einstein yielded to, absolute moral authority, as in God. So everything was relative to him. So in this section, you're going to learn and see how Einstein's relativity was created to gaslight everybody and hide the motionless Earth that was discovered through all those experiments, to hide God behind heliocentrism, and ultimately to set the stage for the ecumenical things that happened later in the 1900s, like climate change, environmentalism, New Age, quantum ideology, transhumanism, and all these ecumenical forbidden fruit manifestations happened because of Einstein's relativity. Of course, he wasn't the only thing contributing to this, but he was a very influential player in the development of what we see today, with this mystery religion coming to the forefront in everything, both in politics, in spirituality, and in science. So you can see all these things really come together in the present time. But first, I want to look at some major quotes from all of these physicists, including people like Einstein, so you can see that they don't know left or right, and that they themselves believe that it is equally possible to explain the world from the perspective of a motionless Earth and the heavens moving. So let's read a couple of these quotes. This first one is from Einstein, and it says, why is this, Okay, there we go. For some reason, I didn't like the margin on this thing was not the way it used to be. Anyway, let's read. Here we go. Either coordinate system, this is Einstein, either coordinate system could be used with equal justification. The two sentences, the sun is at rest and the earth moves, or the sun moves and the earth is at rest, would simply mean two different conventions concerning two different coordinate systems. So it doesn't matter. It's all relative. This one's from Einstein also. I have come to believe that the motion of the earth cannot be detected by any optical experiment. Albert Einstein, Kyoto University, Japan, December 14th, 1922. And the meme says, when you can't prove it in an experiment, it's called a belief. Exactly. There's no experimental proof for any of heliocentrism's claims. It just superimposes a mathematical conjecture on top of what you see and explains it away from you. Your senses tell you this is what it is. And that points you to God. Heliocentrism, because it's Antichrist, jumps in front and says, no, this is actually what's happening. Look. And it points you to a delusion. This one's also from Einstein. Imagination is more important than knowledge. A lot of people quote this quote, but they don't realize the implication of it. Here we are with Einstein and our good old Jesuit buddy who developed the Big Bang, Georges Lemaitre. Just best buds hanging out. This is from Fred Hoyle. We might hope, therefore, that Einstein theory, which is well suited to such problems, would throw more light on the matter. But instead of adding further support to the heliocentric picture of the planetary motions, the Einstein theory goes in the opposite direction, giving increased respectability to the geocentric picture. Fred Hoyle, an essay on his life and work of Nicholas Copernicus. This is also Fred Hoyle. I don't know if you can see it. Let's see if we can zoom in. We know that the difference between a heliocentric theory and a geocentric theory is one of relative motion only, and that such a difference has no physical significance. Well, it does have physical significance, but because these people are all mathematicians and theoretical mystics and philosophers, they admit to you that it could go either way. Either the heavens are moving and the earth is still, or the earth is moving and the heavens are still. This was, by the way, in Astronomy and Cosmology, page 416, by Fred Hoyle. Astrophysicist George Ellis explains, quote, people need to be aware that there is a range of models that could explain the observations. For instance, I cannot construct you a spherically symmetrical universe with Earth. I can construct you a spherically symmetrical universe with Earth at its center, and you cannot disprove it based on observations. You can only exclude it on philosophical grounds. In my view, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I want to bring into the open is the fact that we are using philosophical criteria in choosing our models. A lot of cosmology tries to hide that. Astrophysicist George F.R. Ellis. What does he tell you? Exactly what I've been telling you, that this is philosophy. And of course, it's the philosophy of Satan, as you can see throughout history. Henry Poincaré, who basically developed the initial points of relativity, which Einstein basically took and brought them to the world. A great deal of research has been carried out concerning the influence of Earth's movement. The results were always negative, i.e., the Earth isn't moving. Does he confirm to you the truth of what those experiments in the 1800s proved? Of course. That's not what Wikipedia tells you, but the person who pretty much developed relativity, which is Henry Poincaré, and Einstein took his work and moved it forward, he tells you, yeah, all the experiments that have been done to try to prove the Earth moving have been negative. This is from, an article basically on the Hubble constant. Remember, we talked about how the Hubble's law is basically a fraud. Hubble was a fraud. But this says, Hubble pointed out that his data showed that the galaxies are uniformly distributed in space. He then stated, the assumption of uniformity has much to be said in its favor. If the distribution were not uniform, it would either increase with distance or decrease. But we would not expect to find a distribution in which the density increases with distance, symmetrically in all directions. Such a condition would imply that we occupy a unique position in the universe, analogous in a sense to the ancient conception of a central Earth. The hypothesis cannot be disproved, but it is unwelcome and would be accepted only as a last resort in order to save the phenomenon. Therefore, we disregard this possibility and consider an alternative, namely a distribution which thins out with distance. I.e., we reject this model, just like Ellis said, on philosophical grounds, because the idea of an Earth that is the center of the universe, like the Bible says, is untenable. Why? Because it means you have to be accountable to God, and they don't want to do that, because it's Antichrist. This is I. Bernard Cohen. There is no planetary observation by which we on Earth can prove that the Earth is moving in an orbit around the Sun. Birth of New Physics, page 78. Lawrence M. Krauss. But when you look, he's another famous physicist, but when you look at the cosmic background radiation map, you also see that the structure that is observed is in fact, in a weird way, correlated with the plane of the Earth around the Sun. Is this Copernicus coming back to haunt us? That's crazy. We're looking out at the whole universe. There's no way there could be a correlation of structure with our motion of the Earth around the Sun. The plane of the Earth around the Sun, the ecliptic. That would say we are truly at the center of the universe. The new results are either telling us that all of science is wrong and we're at the center of the universe, or maybe the data is simply incorrect. Or maybe it's telling us there's something weird about the microwave background results, that maybe there's something wrong with our theories on the larger scales. The idea that the Earth is the center of the universe is untenable for these people. So they're panicking, and of course new discoveries are constantly being made, and they've been made since the 1800s, to prove biblical cosmology, but they constantly get swept under the rug and re-mathematized, reinterpreted. You'll see this constantly today with relativity and quantum. This is now Martin Gardner, The Relativity Explosion, page 184 to 185. One could just as legitimately assume the Earth to be fixed and the entire universe with its great spherical cloud of black body radiation to be moving. The equations are the same. Indeed, from the standpoint of relativity, the choice of reference frame is arbitrary. Naturally, it is simpler to assume the universe is fixed and the Earth is moving than the other way around, but the two ways of talking about the Earth's relative motion are two ways of saying the same thing. So there you go, Martin Gardner. Here's another one from page 87 on the same book by the same person. Do the heavens revolve or does the Earth rotate? The question is meaningless. A waitress may just as sensibly ask a customer if he wanted ice cream on top of his pie or the pie placed under his cream. Now, of course, if you're an atheist, oh yeah, it doesn't matter. They're recognizing to you the truth. But as a Christian, you should realize that it does matter. It incredibly matters. Because one is a false cosmology designed to introduce all sorts of spiritual ideas and ultimately bring the world back to the beast. And the other one is the true cosmology, which points you to God and gives you peace and arms you against all of these deceptions like sci-fi, transhumanism, asteroids coming to kill you, evolution, climate change, ecumenism, all kinds of things that we talked about. So they have drastically different implications because one is the truth and one is a lie. It's not that they are just relative. One is the truth and one is a lie. But this is how they hide it, folks, with relativity. Phil Platt, the bad astronomer, I have two things to say that might surprise you. First, geocentrism is a valid frame of reference. And second, heliocentrism is not any more or less correct. They tell you themselves, folks. Stephen Hawking, who knows if he was real or not, but either way, this is what he supposedly said in The Grand Design by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinov, New York, Bantam, 2010, page 41. Quote, so which is real, the Ptolemaic or the Copernican system? Although it is not uncommon for people to say that Copernicus proved Ptolemy wrong, that is not true. One can use either picture as a model of the universe, for our observations of the heavens can be explained by assuming either the earth or the sun to be at rest. So there you go, all the great minds. And of course, this last one by Tesla, which I love. Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. That's exactly the truth. Exactly. Very good quote. So, conclusion is that straight from their mouths, what do you see? They admit it themselves, that geocentrism, we're looking at all these people believe in heliocentric theory. And their foundational names in physics, what do they all tell you? They tell you that geocentrism is a valid frame of reference. So when anybody calls you stupid for believing the earth is the center of the universe, as the Bible tells you, that this is the universe basically, or that you believe in an enclosed cosmology or biblical earth, just point them to these quotes. That it is a completely rational and reasonable way to interpret what you see. That the earth is still and that the heavens are the ones moving. And actually, you have empirical proof of your position that the earth is not moving. And they don't have empirical proof of their position that the earth is moving. They don't. There's no empirical proof that the earth is moving. And of course, you saw that from their own mouth. When you look up at the heavens and you see the sun and the moon and the stars, like if you see a time lapse and a star trail, the natural interpretation is that the earth is still and that the heavens are the ones that are moving. Now, of course, they can be argued that, well, maybe if you look at it long enough, it seems like the earth is the one moving and you're in this giant void, but that's a story that's been implanted in your mind. That's a story of reality. The reason why every single ancient culture had the same idea, of course, they had slight variations on it, of course, but they all had the same idea that the earth was not moving and the heavens were full of local luminaries that were moving. They all had that idea because when you look up at it and you don't have anybody whispering into your ear, no, this is actually what's happening. It's all these things happening and there's this and that and there's a giant void and you're floating through it without anybody putting that little story over your eyes. The natural interpretation is that the earth is not moving and the heavens are the ones that are moving. But how do we know? Well, we know because the Coriolis effect doesn't exist. We proved that. If it did exist, then you could take a helicopter, hover above the ground, and just wait for the Earth to move underneath you. You don't really feel the effects of moving at 1,000 or whatever miles per hour and 66,000 miles per hour through the solar system and all of these supposed crazy movements. And again, the Bible says that the Earth is the center of the universe. The sun and the moon were created after the Earth. The Earth is unmovable. It's on pillars. It's founded to be forever. It's the rock that you're standing on. And again, that rock points to the true rock, which of course is God. So now the big $1 million question, folks, is if these scientists themselves admit that geocentrism is a valid frame of reference, and your senses agree, and the Bible agrees, and empirical evidence agrees, why do they still insist on the heliocentric model? Why? Why the push for this model? This is why this is called the heliocentric conspiracy. Because it's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy by the devil, first and foremost, with all of his lemmings. Remember all those experiments that proved the Earth wasn't moving, that they themselves admit. Henry Poincaré admits it, which is why he developed relativity. But either way, that's a different story. These things were a devastating blow to the globe model. If people found out the correct cosmology, it would point them to the Bible. There would be a revival because they would realize, oh my gosh, the Bible's true. And that means God is real and the gospel is true and Jesus was right and we need to repent. Do you see the chain of events that would unfold and how Satan could not let that happen? So when these things happened in science, there needed to be an immediate pivot away into more delusion. Enter relativity and special relativity with Einstein. Today we're going to let somebody else do the talking who's very well versed in these things. He's an astronomer on YouTube. Not a very big channel, but he's got some great videos on this topic, and I highly recommend you watching his videos. We're going to watch quite a few of them today and comment on them. They're very well outlined. They're about 10 to 20 minutes, depends on which one. And they're very, very good videos. Some of these things may get into some specific stuff, or it seems like they get sciencey. Again, don't worry. We're going to do our best to make this as simple and intelligible as possible. The point from the very beginning was that don't worry about trying to understand everything. You don't have to understand everything that's going to be discussed in these sections. You don't. You do have to focus, though. You have to focus so you can see what they did. Because again, the evil that they did is obvious. It's very simple. They just inverted the truth. That's a simple thing that anybody can understand. You don't have to understand all the nuts and bolts of relativity and special relativity and quantum mechanics and all these things. We will make it understandable, hopefully as understandable as you can make something that's a total delusion, because these things are very confusing. But we'll make it simple. And the point is, again, that you see through the deception so that when people bring this into the conversation, you aren't deceived. And whatever may happen with all of these things in the future, with quantum and quantum computing and all of the nonsense that's coming down the pipeline, you are armed against it with knowledge and wisdom. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at our first video. And this is called Debunking Einstein's Special Relativity by this channel called It's BS. And again, he's an astronomer and he has got some very good videos on this. This is an entire playlist we're going to be checking out, but not all of it, but just some of them. All right, here we go. And
this video will explain how to prove.
Let's go a little bit slower. I was listening to these super fast, but we can do, let's say 1.5.
Einstein's theory of special relativity wrong. So why should you worry about Einstein's special relativity at all? Because it causes problems for us in terms of advancing our electrical science. If we keep teaching that light and electromagnetism are based on projectile particles, then we will continue to be stalled in advancing electrical science. This is Einstein's paper on special relativity, but realize that it's...
Now, really quick, just to understand, what does he mean by it makes problems with electricity, electrodynamics, understanding the light as particles? What Einstein did, one of the things that he inverted a lot of things, but one of the things he inverted was light and the behavior of light. He basically came up with the idea that light is in quanta. He wasn't the only one, but he kind of really solidified it, meaning photons, particles of light, which is not true. Light is a wave. It waves through a medium like the ether, and we'll get more into that later, but he inverted that from being a wave into a particle. So that's what he means by this. And of course, that understanding is false. It's flawed.
Really an electrical paper. Electrodynamics meaning the movement of electricity. Or today, we usually use the term electromagnetics. You can see here that Einstein's special relativity is what removes the medium for electromagnetism. Now, to give an analogy for what this means, it's like looking out over a lake and seeing the waves, but then removing the medium of water. Now, when we use the word waves, it makes no sense. His theory takes away the logic for the idea of light waves or electromagnetic waves. This theory also creates weird time and space illogical behavior, or paradoxes. The popular one for time would be the twin paradox, and one for space would be the train in the tunnel. So in today's modern science, how much illogic are we willing to accept? So how is special relativity wrong? I am going to focus on two major problems with this theory. The clock paradox is a famous problem, and I learned it by reading this book. It also describes the story of all the academic dogma that surrounds Einstein's theory.
We'll look at the clock paradox in a separate video.
But to this day, the issue of the clock paradox still remains. I think the failure of the spherical wave proof is a lesser known problem with relativity. This is a major issue for the theory of relativity because it is actually what disproves it. In the spherical wave proof, Einstein shows that the principle of relativity is compatible with the speed of the photon, and he assumed his math was right. But when you actually check it, it is wrong. And that takes the entire theory down with it. I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So in the first part of Einstein's paper, he has to describe what he means by the principle of relativity. And then he has to connect that principle to the constant velocity of photons in empty space. He mentions here that they are seemingly incompatible, and the spherical wave proof is where he tries to make them compatible. I learned about the spherical wave proof from Stephen B. Bryant's book, and I'll show you a program that I wrote that calculates the math for the spherical wave proof. So here's a warning. Einstein's relativity can get complex and confusing in a hurry, and realize that if you are debating someone who is a relativist, they will drag you down into the weeds and create complexity in order to defend this theory. And by using complexity, they will usually say that you don't understand relativity and basically walk away from the conversation. This is why I've chosen to focus on these two major problems, and I want to stick to Einstein's own words in his own paper.
Even if you feel intimidated by this stuff, just like he said, when people would call you, oh, you just don't get it, you will understand what Einstein did today. That's my promise to you, is that we'll try to make this as simple as possible, because what he did is actually very simple. And of course, it's the general pattern of history of Antichrist inversion. So
the more you understand about the Doppler effect, the more you will understand how light works in its wave medium. And you'll understand the challenge that Einstein is up against when he removes this medium for light. In the medium of air, we are all familiar with these sound waves. The actual pitch of the sound of the car horn changed because it was moving relative to you. If a visible light source is moving relative to you, then you get a change in color. These changes in the pitch of sound and the color of light are described by the Doppler effect. And in this formula, the letter C stands for the propagation speed of waves in the medium. Einstein removes the medium, and now he has to get real creative in order to explain how light is going to work without a medium. In his photoelectric effect paper that was published a few months earlier, he says that the wave theory of light, which has a medium called the ether, will probably never be replaced by another theory. And then in his special relativity paper, he removes the medium for light waves and replaces it with empty space and light particles. Going back.
Do you see what he did? He first off, he contradicts himself, and you'll see this over and over again with Einstein. He's completely contradicting himself, and people believe he's just this genius. He said, oh, the wave theory of light is never going to be replaced. Of course, because it's true. Schrodinger's equations, which you'll learn about Schrodinger, are a true expression of reality. And then in another paper, he's like, oh, well, actually, it's not really an ether, it's just empty space. Because remember, they have to get rid of the ether. And well, if you get rid of the ether, now you have to describe reality. So they turn the light into a particle that's bouncing around in empty space, which is not true.
Back to the Doppler effect, the speed of waves in the medium is replaced with the speed of the photon particle in empty space. So now we move on to reference frames, or frames of reference. You can just think of these as types of motion. And there are just two types of motion. You're either accelerating or you're not. The reference frames that apply to special relativity are sometimes called Galilean reference frames. These reference frames deal with constant motion. Reference frames that are changing their motion, in other words, accelerating or decelerating, are known as non-Galilean reference frames. Again, the changing motion reference frames do not apply to special relativity. So remember the car horn sound example. Your reference frame would be standing still next to the road, and the car's reference frame would be moving at a constant speed right past you. These are both examples of Galilean reference frames which apply to special relativity. Even though you were standing still, that frame applies and is generally called at rest. Now, these reference frames existed before Einstein. What Einstein changed was the fact that all of these Galilean reference frames are now peer-to-peer and not in a hierarchy. Now, what the heck does that mean? I don't want to bore you with talk about reference frames, but you've got to realize that this idea is what brings a lot of illogic to this theory. It tells us that the person in the moving car can claim that they are at rest and the person on the side of the street is moving. That might sound weird.
Just like Luther's quote, remember? That all basically perspectives are true, which is nonsense.
But the real problem is that there are two different answers to every problem in special relativity, and one of them is always wrong. Don't worry if you don't fully grasp the reference frames idea yet. It's pretty easy, but it's not the way we usually think of things. So we'll first look at the clock paradox, and hopefully this will start to make better sense to you. Let's dive right into the middle of relativity and talk about how time slows down, or the clock paradox. So the idea here is that you have a stationary clock, and then you have a moving clock. And the moving clock will slow down compared to the clock that is at rest. Let's look at that idea in Einstein's paper. It says the clock that has been transported from point A to point B will lag behind the clock that has been at point B from the outset. And that lag time can be calculated by this formula. So he's saying that the moving clock slows down relative to the clock at rest. But in Einstein relativity, either reference frame can claim that they are at rest. So with the peer-to-peer reference frames, which clock do you apply the formula to?
So really quick, what he's highlighting is the fact that Einstein is contradicting himself yet again. In his equations and his thought experiments and examples, he always picks a default frame of rest. You'll see this over and over again, that he says one thing and does another. In relativity, true relativity is that all perspectives are equally valid. So there is no absolute frame of rest. So on what basis do you pick one as the frame of rest over another, which is, of course, nonsense.
Which clock is actually slowing down? It makes no sense that they are both slowing down. You get two different answers here. Each clock has an answer that the other one is slowing down, but only one of those answers can be right. And that is the clock paradox, which still has not been properly answered to this day. So in the next paragraph, Einstein makes this clock paradox mistake himself. He uses an example of an at-rest clock at the equator and another at-rest clock at the South Pole. Since both clocks are at rest and neither one is moving, they should stay synchronized. So he gives another example here. If there are two synchronized clocks at point A, and you just take one of those clocks, move it around at a constant velocity, and then return it to point A, then that moved clock will lag behind the other clock that was at rest by this calculation. From this, we conclude that a balance wheel clock that is located at the Earth's equator must be very slightly slower than an absolutely identical clock that is located at one of the Earth's poles. Let's illustrate this.
Really quick, this is by the way what they use for sci-fi movies like what's it called, where they go in space and he's like, they go down to that planet, but the planet has like 20 times the gravity of the Earth, and then they come back and oh my gosh, 20 years has passed, and all of this sci-fi nonsense. These are just conjectures that time is flowing differently for them, and it's all based on this scientific gobbledygook, basically, which is what Einstein created through his relativity.
Two people are at rest with their synchronized clocks at a table on the equator. Now we can stretch that table all the way down to the South Pole. They're still sitting at the same table. They're both at rest. Therefore, neither clock is slowing down. Now, why did Einstein say that the clock at the Earth's equator must be running slightly slower? So according to National Geographic, the equator moves at 1,000 miles per hour, where the poles hardly move at all. Now, we know that when you are sitting at a table with someone else, neither person is moving. But let's go ahead and throw that idea out and follow along with what Einstein says. When Einstein chose the clock at the equator as the moving clock, or the one that slows, at this point he is being an authority on which reference frame is moving. But Einstein relativity tells us that there is no authoritative frame. They're peer-to-peer. Either person can claim that they are at rest, and the other person is moving. So if Einstein claims that one of these clocks is moving, and that a moving clock slows down, why did he pick the clock at the equator as being the one that slows down? The clock at the equator can claim it is at rest, and the clock at the South Pole is the one that's moving, and therefore should be the one that is slowing. So now you can see that the idea of peer-to-peer reference frames creates two different answers every time. And one of those answers is obviously wrong. So Einstein threw away one of the two answers. He was the authority that chose the equator clock as moving, and he fell into his own clock paradox trap in his own paper. So then, what did Einstein himself have to say about this clock paradox? So my personal opinion, and from a scientific viewpoint, this paper is where I lost a lot of respect for Einstein. I believe he is trying to just defend his theory instead of trying to figure out what's really going on in nature. This paper was written 13 years later, and he is writing a simulated dialogue between a critic of the theory of relativity and someone who believes in the theory of relativity. So we have clock 2 moving at a constant velocity towards point B and then back to point A. Upon arrival to point A, that clock is braked. Now look what he's doing here. In his thought experiment, he is now adding in deceleration. Now he's going to talk about the clock paradox of which clock is really slowing down. So according to Einstein's relativity, the process has to occur in exactly the same way when you switch reference frames. So that means we will get a second answer when clock 1 is moving and clock 2 is at rest. So now clock 1 says it is slower than clock 2. Even the devoutest adherents of the theory cannot claim that of two clocks resting side by side, each one is slow relative to the other. So after 13 years, Einstein tries to explain this away and says the entire line of reasoning is not legitimate because one of the frames of reference in this thought experiment was accelerated. Okay, let's go with that, but it still leaves the question, how do you know which frame of reference the clock is moving slower? How do you determine which answer to throw out? Each reference frame can still claim it is at rest and sees the other person as moving and accelerating and decelerating. So does nature somehow figure out which frame of reference is accelerating? I don't know. In my opinion, it was a terrible answer. And I don't think a lot of relativists even use his answer to try to explain the paradox. Now, this clock paradox does not prove that this theory is incorrect. It just proves that there is something wrong. The failure of the spherical wave proof is what invalidates this entire theory. This proof is in section 3 of the relativity paper. From the rest system, it takes x, y, z, and time coordinates, then calculates some math, and that tells you about the reference frame that is in motion. So here are the equations that show you how to slow time and shrink space. This is the most important paragraph in this paper. It says, "For we have not yet provided the proof that the principle of the constant speed of light is compatible with the Einstein relativity principle." And that's the whole point of this paper. Remember on the first page where he says that they are seemingly incompatible, his principle of relativity and the constant speed of light. So how do we prove this? It's all right here. So when the moving system and the system at rest are at the same point in time, you send out a sphere of photons. So the rest system equation is this. Then you use the transform equations that tells you about the moving system. And the answer to this moving system equation should be a sphere when observed in the moving system. This proves that our two fundamental principles are compatible. All right, let's give it a try. So this is a simple program that I wrote in Python, and it will plot the stationary observer's view of the light sphere after 1 second of time. And let's run it. And here's the graph. So for the stationary observer, we have this sphere after 1 second of time, or 1 light second. The idea here is that the moving frame will match up perfectly with the stationary observer at 0, 0 in this coordinate system. At that point, at time 0, a light pulse goes off. And I am using the idea of light seconds, where in 1 second, it will travel the distance of 1 unit. In 2 seconds, it will travel the distance of 2 units on the graph. This is the program for the moving reference frame. Here I have it programmed to go 3/4 the speed of light, and then we'll plot the graph and see what it looks like. You can see here that the moving observer does not see a sphere. This is what disproves Einstein's special theory of relativity. You can see that the stationary observer sees the light pulse as a sphere after 1 second, but the moving observer sees an ellipse. And Einstein,
Which makes sense. Think about it. If you're standing still, something is going to look different than if you're moving at a particular rate past something and that thing is doing something. It's going to look a little different, in this case with light going off.
Einstein says right here that the moving observer should see a sphere. When you get closer to the speed of light, for instance, 98% of the speed of light, and you run the program, you can see that the ellipse becomes even more pronounced. One thing I did to try to check my work was I had my program spit out a bunch of coordinates that I could just stuff into this graphing calculator that is online. So this is the stationary observer after 1 second. So if you haven't already noticed, I've dropped the z coordinate so I don't have to work in 3 dimensions. The moving frame will be at 75% of the speed of light, and I'll run this. And all this does is spit out a bunch of coordinates that I'll just copy and paste over into the Desmos graphing calculator. And now I'll paste them in here. And all this is doing is giving me an idea that my Python graph is not doing anything weird. In other words, I'm just checking it with a different source. And as you can see here, the stationary light sphere and the moving coordinate system don't match. This is obviously an ellipse.
So as you increase the speed of the observer across this point where there would be a light source being emitted, you get a different observation. Meaning, if you actually do the math, what you come out with is a refutation of the idea that all perspectives are equal. There's one frame of rest always, and the math proves it.
Let's try it again at 98% the speed of light. Run the program, dump the coordinates, and copy them. Now I'll paste these into Desmos, square up the graph, zoom in, and it's pretty clear that these don't match up, and the spherical wave proof fails in Einstein's special theory of relativity. I'll put the source code in the description of the video in case you want to use it to write your own program, or just check to make sure I didn't do anything too stupid. But I have one more thing to show you before I wrap up this video. I would like to demonstrate a couple of these animations to help tie everything together. So we have 2 different frames of reference that are showing the same event. When this train car goes by this post, it sends out a light pulse. Since this is Einstein relativity, you have 2 answers, one with the boxcar moving and one with the pole moving. With the boxcar at rest, you're going to get this answer. With the pole at rest, you're going to get a different answer. And you know from what I just showed you in this video that one of these answers is wrong. Now this animation simulates if there was an ether medium at rest. This is a simulation of frames of reference prior to Einstein relativity. In the top frame, imagine that you're standing at the end of a dock and you drop a brick in the water. In the bottom frame, you are in the boat and you're looking at the dock and see the brick being dropped into the water. So on the top frame, you can watch the boat go by, and on the bottom frame, when you're in the boat, you watch the dock go by. So with the wave medium as the authoritative frame of reference, all of these events just line up naturally.
You see that? Let's look at this
The
again.
brick being dropped into the water. So on the top frame, you can watch the boat go by.
See how they're at the same, because the wave medium is the objective frame of reference, the ether. And so both of these are happening at the same.
And on the bottom frame, when you're in the boat, you watch the dock go by. So with the wave medium as the authoritative frame of reference,
See, they're same time.
all of these events just line up naturally. So I'll leave you with that idea to think about. And at this point, the video is over.
So some of the stuff I know can be over our heads, but it doesn't matter. We're going to still watch some more videos. It'll all make sense eventually. The point is that you understand that Einstein brought relativism to science through his theories. Light, let's review some basics. Light propagates through a medium called the ether. We don't know exactly what that is. It's some sort of electromagnetic, luminiferous thing where, let there be light. Let there be light in the universe, and light propagates through this medium. But light is a wave, and it works like waves through water or sound through the air and all these other energetic situations. Just like all these things, the medium for light is the ether, just like water is for waves and so on. Most people believed in the ether up until the 1900s, and of course that was a problem because that points you back to a stationary Earth, to the Bible, and so on. Einstein got rid of the ether because the ether was the main problem for heliocentrism. As a result, he inverted the truth. He took something, which is the ether, a medium, again, like water, for like waves have water and sound has air. Energy, electricity, light has ether. Well, he took something of the ether and he inverted it to nothing. He created empty space. As a result, you have to have an explanation for light. And how does light work? Well, it works through particles, actually. Particles are bouncing around in this empty space, which is nonsense. That's not how they work at all. And you'll see why over and over again. But he inverted the truth. And he, as a result of inverting the ether from something to nothing, he had to invert light from a wave to a particle. And that, as a result, creates a whole host of confusing situations because the light is not a particle. And if you're going to treat it like a particle, you have to make all sort of philosophical and mathematical conjectures to make things work because they don't work. Particles and waves are two different things. A particle is a solid thing. It's a thing that's bouncing around, whereas a wave is a wave. It's waving through a medium, a material. So very, very different. We'll come back to all these things a little bit later. But today, it's about understanding that the particle and the wave are two different things. And eventually, what they did was create some, in quantum mechanics, wave-particle duality, meaning they treat the particle like a wave. I know it sounds confusing, and it is confusing because it doesn't make any sense. And you'll see why. But they're treating the particles in these equations as waves. That's why they still get results with these, conjectures. And you'll see Neil deGrasse Tyson says, "Oh, it works. It works. Relativity works. That's why we use it." Well, it works to some degree because they're using wave equations, and Schrodinger's wave equations actually describe reality because everything does work as a wave, especially on micro levels with atoms. More on that later. But again, Einstein brought relativism to science, to physics, to movement observations. Everything is relative. And when you do that, it's total nonsense. You can see that even he himself, in order to claim anything, he had to take an authoritative position and say, well, no, this is the frame of rest, why did you pick that one and not the other one? And the other one could say the same thing as you and invalidate what you're saying. So it's very, very contrived and confusing and philosophical, and it's contradictory. It doesn't make any sense. Relativity is nonsense. But again, you'll see how it's been adapted, and Schrodinger's wave equations were hijacked in order to make relativity work, and people today are never the wiser. There is always an objective frame of reference. Just use your senses. When you're standing there just looking at things, whether you're seeing cars drive by or you're at the beach and you're seeing birds move in the air, there's an objective frame of reference, which is the earth. The earth is not moving. That's how you can tell what's moving and what's not. You have an objective frame of reference. Just like you have God, again, everything in creation points to God. God is the objective frame of everything, of reality, of morality. You know what is good or evil because of what God said, God's word, and so on and so forth. If a car moves past you, you know that you're standing still and the car is moving past you. You know that. You know that because of your senses and because the earth is an objective frame of reference. It's not moving. But relativity uses philosophy and math to tell you that, well, you could be standing still, or you could be the one moving. It's the car that's standing still and you're moving past the car. That's how relativity accomplishes its gaslighting, and how it uses that to confuse you into questioning whether the earth is moving when you look at the stars or the stars are moving. Well, it could be either. You don't know. Well, you do know. We have empirical proof. We have our senses. We have the Bible, and we have observations. So all of these things align with a geocentric, motionless earth. But relativity, if you let the snake wiggle its tongue in your ear, confuses you into accepting the possibility of, no, actually the earth is moving. It's the heavens that are still, just like all of these other ridiculous examples. And that's why it's gaslighting. It's gaslighting you. It makes no sense. And Einstein obviously contradicts himself many times. You'll see in some of these other papers and videos where he continually contradicts himself. Very confused person, very deluded, very confused. And his math equations actually don't pan out under scrutiny, like the spherical wave proof. If you don't know what that is, you don't need to. It's okay. It's just a particular mathematical proof that when you actually do the numbers and you see what happens when somebody is moving as he approaches the speed of light, the result is that the two experiences don't match. If you're standing still and you see a light go off in a particular pattern, like 1 second, a little burst of light in a sphere, okay, that's going to look different than if you're moving past that situation at the speed of light. Of course, that's not possible, but let's say you were, theoretically, you're going to see a different thing if you're moving at the speed of light. Whereas relativity says that both of those are equally true. No, one of them is true and one of them is not. If I'm moving super fast, I'm going to see something distorted. If I'm not moving, I'm not going to see it distorted. It's very common sense. But relativity, of course, abolishes all common sense, and math can disprove it. People like this guy have disproven it with math and with just common sense. So, video 2 is the twins paradox. This one's a little bit shorter. Let's check it out.
Most of the twins paradox explanations go
Chipmunk speed. Let's do playback speed 1.5.
through a similar scenario to this, where one twin is on the Earth and the other is in a spaceship. The problem with this is that it leads you to easily dismiss the first postulate of Einstein's special relativity. It is called the principle of relativity, and it requires that both of these scenarios that you're seeing are equally valid. It is easier for people to understand that the twin on the Earth is actually at rest and the spaceship is doing all of the moving. But the scenario where the planet and the star are moving and the spaceship is at rest should not be discarded. Otherwise, why have the principle of relativity at all if you're always going to discard one of the scenarios?
Keep that in mind. This is a very important statement. Why have the principle of relativity at all if you're always going to discard one of the scenarios? One of the scenarios, in this case, it's either the spaceship that's moving and the Earth is at rest relative to what's going on, or the spaceship is standing still and the Earth and everything else is moving, and that's the frame of rest. Relativity says both of these are true, but they're not. One of them is true. And of course, when they're doing their equations and thought experiments, they always have to cancel one of the answers in order to solve for anything, because relativism doesn't allow you to make any claims because it's all true. You see how much nonsense it is? And people are believing that relativity is this advanced thing, and oh my gosh, it's this crazy thing that Einstein came up with. It's nonsense.
I prefer the scenario where you just have empty space and two spaceships. But you might be thinking that the twin paradox is not a paradox at all, or it's already been solved. This is just a small list of peer-reviewed journal papers by physicists trying to explain the twins paradox. Obviously, you can see that there are different methods being used to try to explain it, and the debate is still ongoing.
Because they don't know left from right, and they're confused by the devil, by his schemes, and just by all these deceptions.
So back to the scenario. We have empty space, and this spaceship is moving at a fast rate to the left. You're going to see that it is passing another spaceship that is sitting at rest. Sorry, just kidding. This is the spaceship that is at rest, and then you're going to see another one fly by. There it goes. It's the same animation either way. So that's the idea of the principle of relativity. You can't tell which one is at rest or which one is moving, so both reference frames have a valid point of view in this case. Let's take a look at Einstein's 1905 paper and what he says about the principle of relativity. Einstein is proposing to get rid of this idea of a universal at rest. And now any coordinate system can claim that they are at rest as long as they meet the criteria of constant motion or no motion. Coordinate systems that are accelerating or decelerating do not apply to the principle of relativity. At the start of section 2, Einstein again defines the principle of relativity. I put up a second translation here because the wording is kind of clumsy. So in one of the scenarios, this spaceship was at rest. We will assign it a time equals 2. That way we can calculate what the moving spaceship's clock looked like. So to the stationary spaceship, it looked like the moving spaceship's clock was slower. Okay, there's no problem at this point. But using the principle of relativity, we can say that this spaceship was at rest and this one was moving. So we have a rest time of 2, and now this one has a clock that is moving slower. This is the basic clock paradox, and this is the beauty of the principle of relativity. It's very symmetric, but it creates an illogical contradiction. Which clock is actually moving slower? Now, some explanations just say, who cares? It's a disagreement about clocks. Now, this is where the twins come in. What you do is you replace the clocks, you make it a little bit more serious by putting in a biological clock. So now you can say, wait a second, if it's two twins, how do they age if both clocks are moving slower? It makes no logical sense to say that both twins are aging slower at the same time. So this is how simple the twins paradox really is. You don't need to go into some complex scenario. All you're doing is just making a slow clock seem a little bit more real. Now, there's no solution to this, but Einsteiners will explain their way out of pretty much anything. So the next logical step would be to say, hey, we have a valid math answer from the relativity equations right here and right here. So two valid math answers, they both can't be right. So which math answer is the correct one? Again, the first postulate of Einstein's relativity is the principle of relativity, and it is giving us all of this information. So let's look at this in a different way. Let's go down one more layer. And
because relativity says everything is true, like both of these situations are true, that is contradictory, self-contradictory. That's the issue.
just ask, well, who is really doing the moving? Einstein's relativity has math that depends on velocity. For example, in order to calculate these clocks, we need to know who is actually moving. They depend on a speed. And right now, the principle of relativity is telling us that they're both at rest and they're both moving. That is an obvious logical contradiction. So let's just look at this as a velocity paradox. Here are the relativity equations that are applied to the coordinate system that is moving. This is the time coordinate or clock, and this is x, y, and z of the moving system. This is where the slower moving clock comes from, and it requires a velocity. So the first postulate of the principle of relativity says that you can be at rest or you can be the moving frame. But we have specific math for the moving frame. That is...
You get it? The math, again, you don't have to understand what these equations do or how to solve them or anything else. The math is based on velocity, meaning something has to be moving. That's the problem with these equations. They're self-refuting.
Is the paradox, and the special relativity theory itself does not have a resolution for it. It doesn't tell you which one is moving. So you get the too slowing clock paradox or the aging twins issue. And now you know that it gives you two different answers, but doesn't tell you which one is correct. So in special relativity, you can't have each frame claiming that they're moving and not moving. It just doesn't work. It is absolutely a logical contradiction or paradox. It has not been resolved. So here we have an example of Einstein's mind virus. The theory declares a symmetrical relationship, but this theory requires asymmetry in order to resolve the clock paradox, or to figure out who is actually moving faster. Symmetry and asymmetry are exact opposites, so both of these cannot be correct. So why does Einstein's theory have the principle of relativity if you're always trying to get rid of it to resolve these paradoxes? Most of the twins' explanations have this workaround built in. Many times the explanations try to invalidate.
This is how they're going to do. They're going to work around this problem, which is a major problem, with conjectures and math and all sorts of clever ways. So pay attention.
A frame. And what that means is one of the frames will claim to be influenced by gravity or acceleration, deceleration, which means it does not apply to special relativity. That invalidated frame is then said to be the one that is moving. Another common workaround is to explicitly say or agree which frame is at rest. This way is a little sneakier at how to go about invalidating Einstein's principle of relativity. But what it's really doing is kind of bringing back the idea of absolute space. Or the relativity theory that was prior to Einstein, they used the ether as the at-rest reference frame in the universe. So again, if you're going to use these types of workarounds to invalidate a frame or declare who is moving and who is at rest, then why do we even have the first postulate in Einstein's theory of relativity?
I think I know why we have it.
The answer to that is because it is used in section 2 of his paper when he tries to define something called relative simultaneity. Now, this is where the actual bug in Einstein's theory lives. In a future video, I will be doing a walkthrough that shows you exactly how to invalidate the entire theory of relativity via relative simultaneity.
So, the twins paradox is the same thing as the clock paradox. And again, the problem with relativity is that it creates contradictory situations. It's relativism. You don't have to be a science nerd to understand the problem that relativism brings forward. Relativism says that all truths are true. Reincarnation and resurrection cannot both be true. Either we reincarnate and we go to the next life forever and ever and ever until we ascend, or we resurrect at the end of time. And some will be resurrected to glory while others will be resurrected and be thrown in the lake of fire. One of those is true. And of course, we know which one it is. But the point is that relativism tells you, well, all things are true. They're just as valid, which is the attitude that most people have today, whether they realize it or not. They have been gaslighted into a relativistic mindset. A lot of Christians are too afraid to speak the truth because, oh, well, your truth is true to you and so on and so forth. No, there is an objective truth, and truth is divisive. Truth is divisive because the world hates the truth, whether that's in science or in spirituality or whatever else. So the truth is always objective, and there is objective truth because we have an objectively true and real creator. Truth is an extension of the creator. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And that means that the creator is objective reality. God is objective reality. He's unchanging, therefore objective. You have an objective, unchanging frame of reference, which is God. And the things that he created, like the earth, the motionless earth, that is unchanging, that's just standing still and motionless and objective, is an extension of the greater spiritual truth, which is that God is objective reality. You cannot be standing still and moving at the same time, but relativity tells you that you are. And they have clever mathematical workarounds to use objective frames of reference by saying, oh, well, because of gravity and other things, one of those frames doesn't count for relativity, so we can cancel it, and then now we can actually do our equations and work. It's just nonsense. They have so much conjectures and nonsense they're operating on. They're basically going back to wave equations and things that actually work, but they're going a roundabout way, and just to avoid having to declare that the ether exists and that the earth is motionless. So they're doing it so backwards and so contorted, and it's no wonder that people today who are, especially in physics, like I have a good friend of mine who was a PhD in physics, totally confused. As much as they can spit out math equations and theories and all sorts of definitions, they're totally confused. And this is the unfortunate state of affairs. They use all sorts of things, like I said, like gravity and like, what else was it? Some sort of saying that one is at rest and one is not at rest. Well, that invalidates your perspective of relativity, because relativity says that both are at rest and moving at the same time. Both is true. That means that you can't do anything. Do you understand? You can't move forward. You can't make a claim of any kind, because if both things are true, then you can't work with anything. You need an objective frame of reference in order to move forward and solve for the problem. You need to determine which one is moving, because otherwise you can't do anything. And so what this shows you, folks, is that there's hypocrisy and confusion and delusion in theoretical physics. And of course, that's all courtesy of Einstein, who was the devil's puppet. You saw him with his tongue out. You know where that's from, and you've seen some of those ancient symbols and pagan symbols of the tongue. That's an occult symbol. Even today, all these Hollywood stars that they do that, it's a rebellious symbol, and basically thumbing your nose at God type of thing. But you also hopefully can start to see, again, you don't have to understand this, you just have to see, at the very least, what they're doing, how they're using math to hide and obfuscate and make things confusing and slither around in the bushes and basically make things as confusing as possible. So math is not a source of objective truth. Math is objective in the sense that, 1 + 1 is 2. That's objective. God created mathematics, but the enemy misuses everything to confuse and to gaslight people. The enemy's gift to mankind is relativism. In the garden, the devil told Eve, you can determine what's good and evil, not God. God is the objective authority of morality, and he's the standard. We know what is good or evil based on what he says is good or evil. Otherwise, we don't know what is good or evil. If we are the ones determining what is good or evil, that's relativism. Because if I'm determining something that's good and you're determining something that's evil, what does it matter? Well, we're both true. And how do you govern a world where everybody has a different understanding of what's good or evil? This is the problem. But relativism is part of the forbidden fruit. And relativism, like I said, science is not immune from the devil's schemes, folks. Science has been corrupted for a long time. And the devil, one of the things the devil uses with science is relativism, especially in the last 120 years because of the issues of the 1800s like we outlined. A lot of people think that if there's a lot of math on big chalkboards and equations and, all these disheveled people like Einstein, they must be so smart. Well, no, they're very clever deceivers, but they're not smart. They're confused. They are confused, hypocritical deceivers that are just lost in their own minds. They're philosophers. They are philosophers. They're not scientists. This is conjecture, not reality. Reality, they always, for calculating reality, they always have to basically undo their own principles and come to some sort of objective truth to agree upon in order to move the calculation forward. Do you see the hypocrisy? Where one hand he says, well, everything is equally valid and true, but then on the other hand, if you actually want to get some answers and calculate any kind of physics problem, you have to cancel one of these answers. You have to cancel one of the frames of reference. And so the question is, on what authority do you cancel that frame of reference when it's true? If it's true that if I'm moving in my cart across the earth, and also the earth is also moving under me, and I'm standing still, which are two contradictory things, on what basis do you cancel one of those and say this one's true and that one's not true? On what basis do you do that if they're both true? Do you see the absolute mind-numbing stupidity that this is? But they do it anyway because they're just deceived, and they end up using wave equations and just solving for what it is. Anyway, you'll learn more about that. This is Relativity Myth, and this is video number 3. Let's make sure that it's not chipmunk speed. Okay, here we go.
Let's go ahead and start with this clip.
When and if Einstein's theory of relativity
Still chipmunk speed. Let's do 1.25. Some of these are a little faster than others.
will be fully discredited.
It will never be discredited because it works.
Now, this isn't a terrible answer, and since I'm trying to discredit Einstein's theory, then I definitely need some good, tangible evidence that anyone can understand. Before I get to the actual bug in special relativity, I need to discuss the myth of Einstein. And I need to make you aware of the sources that Einstein used to build his theory of special relativity. Because understanding the Einstein myth and the history of relativity will help solidify your understanding of Einstein's confusion within his own theory. Einstein got a lot of credit for things that he didn't do. It's almost like the name Einstein was turned into a brand for theoretical scientific genius.
I wonder why.
And to back this claim up, all you have to do is look at the history books. Not only is E.T. Whittaker a great scientific historian, he was a scientist that was an active part of the scene of which he wrote about. Maybe you would think that a chapter on the theory of relativity would be mainly about Albert Einstein. And as you can see here, that is not the case. And the dispute still lives on.
If you see this, actually, I wonder if I can get back here just a little bit. If you see this book, you can't really tell. Let me see if I can magnify it. Well, it's kind of blurry. Here's the chapter on relativity of Poincaré and Lorentz. See the chapter? And he goes on to talk about all these things that these people are doing. And then finally, Einstein has like one little section here. So Einstein is not, you have to understand that Einstein is not this genius that came along and just totally flipped the world upside down and discovered this great thing. He was propped up. Again, who knows to what degree he was part of the club, but he was definitely a puppet of the devil. The people before him, Poincaré and Lorentz, were already doing relativistic things because, again, the 1800s proved that the Earth wasn't moving. But anyway, moving on.
The dispute still lives on. You can read all about it on Wikipedia. Einstein the plagiarist. Now, I don't care what opinion you end up with on this topic. I'm not trying to personally discredit him and then make you think that is why his theory is wrong. But in his 1905 special relativity paper, Einstein didn't give any credit, sources, citations to anyone except his friend, Mr. Bessel. And that helped create this idea of Einstein's miracle year. The common storyline describes Einstein as working in isolation as a patent clerk, and he used thought experiments to come up with all of these game-changing physics ideas. The math that was used in Einstein's paper came from these sources. This relativity math was created 18 years prior to Einstein's theory. And these are sources for the concepts about relativity that Einstein used. Before I go into more detail here, I want to quickly talk about Einstein's Nobel Prize. Einstein's work was nominated for a Nobel Prize for over a decade, but he was constantly rejected. This quote shows strong opposition from at least one of the members of the committee. So why the heck would they do this?
Let's see, what was that quote really quick?
So why the heck would they do strong opposition?
This is by Gullstrand, one of the people on the Nobel Prize committee. Probably before the Nobel Prize was corrupted and now it just means nothing. But anyway, Einstein must never receive a Nobel Prize even if the whole world demands it.
From at least one of the members of the committee. So why the heck would they do this? The committee members are also scientists, and they viewed his work as science fiction and also full of contradictions. And look, in the end, the dissenting members were correct. But a compromise was reached. I think 2 of the members actually died that were on that committee, and Einstein got his award. Okay, let's look at the math that
I wonder if they died mysterious deaths.
Einstein used for his theory. These are the math formulas that Einstein uses in his paper, and they are known today as the Lorentz transformations. These equations were first derived by Waldemar Voigt in 1887. Now realize he derived these equations via oscillations of the ether, and the speed of light in these derivations are based on wave speed of the medium, or the wave speed of the ether, and not the speed of a photon particle like Einstein.
Remember what I said, that they hijacked the wave equations? Light and energy and subatomic particles and everything works as a wave in this energy toroidal world that we live in. It's very fascinating. But these people derive these equations based off of wave mechanics, meaning how waves propagate through a medium, whether it's sound or water waves or whatever else, or light. Einstein hijacked, you'll see they're the same thing. All he did is just change the characters. He hijacked these equations and appropriated it to his nonsense so that it could still create, mathematical results, but he would hide it under conjectures and philosophy, things like photon bouncing around through empty space. That's nonsense. But it works, like Neil deGrasse Tyson said, because they're using wave equations, which again is just so unnecessarily complicated and confusing.
Here are the equations for Voigt's transformations. Now somehow Einstein and Voigt landed on the same Greek letters for their transformation.
See that? Let's see this. Same ones. Same letters. What is this? Epsilon, nu, something. I don't know. Same letters.
Equations. So if you look here at what is now called the Lorentz factor, you can see that this is v squared and omega is c squared. And in Einstein's paper, all of the movement is along the x-axis. And in Voigt's paper, you just divide everything by q and you get equivalent transformation equations. And if you want to learn more about the origin of the Lorentz transformations, which are really Voigt transformations that Einstein also reused, you can take a look at this paper. I'll have links for all of this stuff down in the description.
Remember, this is all around the time that Michelson-Morley was doing that light experiment, and they had to say that, well, it was the apparatus that was shrinking. That's why you couldn't tell a difference between the light, i.e. relativity and relativism, because otherwise then the Earth isn't moving. So
Voigt creating these math transformations is not a secret. You can see this article from Physics Today from 1988, and it's recognizing the 100-year anniversary of these transformations. But just out of curiosity, what did Lorentz say about these Voigt transformations? So let's make it bigger. And he says they might have been borrowed from Voigt. So one quick question before we move on. If there is a medium that fills all of space, and the relativity math was derived from the waves that propagate through that medium, how can those same math equations then be applied to empty space and projectile light particles or photons? These are opposite ways of viewing nature, but yet it is the same set of math equations. Something to think about. Okay, on to the next question. So if Einstein reused someone else's math for his relativity theory, then what did he actually do? Remember in the beginning of the video, I claimed that Einstein got a lot of credit for things he didn't do. The only thing that Einstein really did was to make the moving frame clock a true time, or a real time. Now, what the heck does that mean? So from the previous video, oh hey look, YouTube thinks I'm a flat earther. All right. Anyway, for Lorentz, this at-rest time was predefined as at rest with respect to the ether. And the moving clock slowed, but this was called a local time or an apparent time. And it was just an effect for this particular moving frame. So then being at rest in the ether was the only true or real time in Lorentz theory. And then all Einstein did was say, nope, this time is also a real or universal time. And that's it. That was Einstein's invention. And then Einstein paired it with the principle of relativity. That gave us a whole new set of clocks and the clock paradox. The clock paradox shows that his new invention is not compatible with the first postulate of his theory, which is the principle of relativity. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you, because this is a very important concept to understand. But don't just believe what I'm saying here. Let's take a look at Albert Einstein's paper from 1907. It's basically the second version of his special relativity paper. So what does Einstein say about his own invention? Right here, one had only to realize that an auxiliary quantity introduced by Lorentz, named by him local time, could be defined as time in general. So what did Lorentz have to say about Einstein's invention? The chief cause of my failure was my clinging to the idea that the variable t, or time, only can be considered as the true time, and that my local time, or the moving time, must be regarded as no more than an auxiliary mathematical quantity. In Einstein's theory, on the contrary, the moving time plays the same part as the rest time. So that's it. Now you know the miracle of Einstein's special relativity.
So Einstein brought relativism to science, basically.
And our GPS system with very accurate atomic clocks prove out Lorentz's ideas versus Einstein's ideas. Einstein's moving clocks and the principle of relativity cannot be applied to our GPS system. Next video.
Yeah, because it's nonsense. Lorentz actually had a frame of rest, which is the ether. But remember, this was a real problem, because then eventually the experiments that were being done were proving that, well, the Earth isn't moving, it's the ether that's the one that exists and moves around the Earth and carrying the stars. I mean, again, we don't know exactly how this thing works, but it's there, and a lot of people believed in it and who were very great minds and were proving it, and that was a real problem. So Einstein took it one step further, because they were saying the ether moving in the ether was, I believe, what Lorentz and Poincaré were saying, is that something that's moving in the ether is the absolute frame of rest, because the ether is a consistent factor. Einstein said, well, the opposite is also true, which is that the thing that's moving can also be the rest frame, and the thing that's at rest can also be moving, it's just all nonsense. It's all based on conjectures and philosophy. It's not true. That's the point. The mainstream narrative of Einstein was that he was this genius who basically kind of was just disheveled and hanging out in a room by himself, and he just figured out these equations, and came up with these things that basically took science to the next level. But of course, in reality, what he did is just he took other people's equations, he added relativism to it, and he was propped up. He was propped up to change science and to basically delude everybody. He changed a few of the characters in the mathematical equations, but they're the same exact equations. He changed how one of them is expressed. If you understand, how algebra works and math, you can express things different ways, but they're still the same equations. So he changed how one of them is expressed. He also changed some characters in one, but they're the same exact equations. And remember, those equations are derived from wave mechanics. They're not derived from particle mechanics. The equations were based on the ether and light moving as a wave. We'll talk again more about this as we go along. But all Einstein ever did was just make things confusing and relative so that the mover can also be a valid frame of rest. But as a result, this is totally contradictory. It doesn't make sense. So you have to do all these workarounds to basically continue to solve for the answer, because you have to cancel one of the frames of reference and make one the objective frame of reference. Just like you had in that example with the two clocks and the equator and the one on the pole. Again, the Earth is not a ball, but let's say it is. If one of them is moving and one of them isn't, on what basis do you pick one over the other? when both are true, when both can be the frame of rest? Why do you pick that one and not the other one? And why do you discount the other one? It's hypocritical. You're breaking your own principle of relativity. And that's the problem. These things are hypocritical and contradictory. And so it doesn't make any sense. The usage of the Lorentz transformations, which again were based on light as a wave through a medium, the ether, but applying them to a particle in empty space is ultimately what led to all the quantum nonsense that we're going to be looking at in a little bit, and the wave-particle duality and so on and so forth. Now, let's see. This is, I believe, the next video. And let's see what speed. Let's do 1.5.
Let's continue this video series by pinpointing the exact problems in Einstein's special relativity paper. The math needed to
Let's do a little bit slower because this is kind of chipmunky, huh?
understand this is very basic. Distance equals rate times time, and that's it. So from the previous relativity myth video, we learned that the only thing Einstein really did was take Lorentz's moving clock and turn it into a true or real time. And from the twins paradox video, we learned that when you take that new real moving clock and pair it with the principle of relativity, it's incompatible because it creates the famous clock paradox. Now, here is what...
In other words, the clock paradox is that you have two contradictory answers that are supposedly both true. But we know that in reality, there's always an objective truth. That's a reflection of the creator. There's always an objectively true situation. One of them is moving, one of them at rest. They're not both moving and at rest and both moving and at rest. That doesn't make any sense. That's the clock paradox, created by relativity, which nobody has ever been able to solve for, as you saw, the last 80 years or whatever it's been.
We are going to focus on in this video. We are going to continually ask, what is the physical reality of making this moving clock another real time or true time? This is Einstein's 1907 statement about what he did in his special relativity paper. So, what is the physical reality of Einstein's new conception of time? It makes one light pulse event somehow become two light pulse events. When the moving frame plays the exact same part as the stationary frame, you get this. And this is what the 1 equals 2 is all about. Walking through the first 3 sections of Einstein's special relativity paper will show you the errors he made to come to this conclusion. Let's look at a demonstration that helps explain this 1 equals 2 problem. As you know from the previous video, Einstein's equations were taken from Voldemar Voigt. Voigt derived these equations from the Doppler effect and oscillations in a medium. So it really shouldn't be a stretch to use a Doppler effect demo to try to give an analogy of this 1 equals 2 idea. So the moving frame of the car is creating a note of F. This is the true note that is being made by the trumpet. Apparently, the stationary observer at the roadside is hearing an F-sharp note. Even though we have 2 different notes in this example, the physical reality is that there's only one note being played, and this is the true note. Now, Einstein's physics wants this F-sharp note to also be a correct answer. Not just apparently, but real or true. And the physical reality for that to happen would mean that this trumpet must be playing 2 different tones at once, or there's a second trumpet in there playing that F-sharp. Hopefully that analogy makes some sense. Einstein wants both of these clocks to be equally valid and real. And when we look at his paper, he uses the idea of a light pulse clock to try to convince us that 1 equals 2. Before we review Einstein's paper, let's take a look at where he got his relativity ideas. This will help us better understand the design behind his special relativity paper. So, Einstein's best thought experiment was to read this paper from Henri Poincaré. Let's look at this 1905 translation of Poincaré's World's Fair speech. At the time, Poincaré was the leader in this idea of the principle of relativity. So in his speech, he was kind of venting his frustration right here. Velocity in relation to the ether. How unsatisfactory that is. So what does this mean? Quick analogy. The speedometer in your car is showing you your velocity in relation to the ground, which is at rest. So instead of the ground being at rest, we have the fluid that fills all of space. And that is the ether. Because velocity is always relative to the ether, Poincaré's frustration here is that the principle of relativity will always kind of be half throttle. You're always relative to the ether. So what did Einstein
They hated the fact that there was an objective frame of reference, and they had to get rid of it.
do about this? He just got rid of the ether and replaced it with something called empty space. This sounds logical, but now instead of having your velocity relative to the ground or the ether that fills space, your velocity is only calculated relative to other objects that are inside of empty space. And now we are in Einstein's world, where relativity is at full throttle. So then Poincaré...
So instead of having an absolute frame of rest, which again, it's true, that when you move, you understand why you're moving at a certain speed because there is a frame of rest. The only way you can tell how fast you're moving is by looking at other things moving and determining your movement in relationship to them. It's total nonsense. It's gaslighting to make you completely confused and disconnect from an objective frame of reference through science. It's relativity and relativism through science.
Went on and discussed the idea of the velocity of light becoming an impassable limit. I think you can see that Einstein read this paper. Otherwise, Poincaré was some kind of a prophet that could foretell the future. Anyway, what Einstein did here was replace the ether waves of the ether medium with projectile light particles, or light quanta, we now call photons. Now, when we say speed of light, instead of it being the speed of a wave in a medium, it is the speed of a projectile particle of light through empty space. Einstein needed this photon idea to be in place before his relativity paper was published. This paper is known as Einstein's photoelectric effect paper, and this is where he introduced the photon just 2 months prior to publishing the relativity theory. So let's take a quick look at how Einstein came up with the idea of the photon. First, he introduces the illogical idea of something we call wave-particle duality. This idea still plagues science today, and it's all in these 2 paragraphs. The basic idea is this: the wave theory of light will probably never be replaced by another theory. But a light ray consists of a finite number of these little tiny energy quanta that can only be absorbed or generated as a whole. Now that sounds great, but the basic illogic is if you generate a particle of light, then how in the world does it ever become a wave in a medium and then go back to a particle and be absorbed? By making this statement, you basically contradict the idea that the wave theory of light will never be replaced by another theory. So here we have another example of Einstein's mind virus. He has 2 opposite ways of viewing light, but only requires one, because he's getting rid of the waves in the ether when it comes to his special relativity theory. Einstein had previously worked on a light particle theory, and I'll use this reference. He had to abandon this light particle theory because these projectile particles wouldn't work. But now he has empty space for the projectiles, and people can still think about waves. That's awesome. So where did Einstein get the math to describe this new projectile photon? He reused a key portion of Max Planck's mathematics from the blackbody radiation experiment. And here's a quick walkthrough of Einstein's photon math. So I'll show you how this turns into HV. First, we have to figure out what Rn is. In the first section of this paper, we find Rn. R is the universal gas constant. N is now known as the Avogadro's number. To figure out what this means, we need to go look back at another Max Planck paper. On page 6, you'll see right here is Avogadro's number. If you fit that into this equation, you'll find that R over N is actually equal to k, which is Boltzmann's constant. So back to the photoelectric equation, we need to figure out what beta is. So in section 2 of Einstein's paper, beta is equal to this number. We have to go back to Planck's 1901 paper to see that h over k is equal to this number. And that is what beta is in Albert Einstein's paper. So if Rn is equal to k, or the Boltzmann's constant, and beta is equal to h over the Boltzmann's constant, then the k's cancel out and you're just left with hv. Okay, so from that quantum flaw video, you saw that Einstein reused Max Planck's math for his photon. And Max Planck's math was based on a blackbody radiation experiment that was sampling 1 second's worth of data in order to get that equation.
I know that he was going through a lot of math, but this part will make a big difference in understanding how ridiculous all of this is.
That creates a whole other issue with Einstein's 1 second photon problem. One last thing about the photon. Let me show you something from this article. Max Planck and these other scientists were recommending Einstein into a German Academy of Sciences. It goes on to say that he may sometimes have missed the target in his speculations, as for example, in his hypothesis of light quanta. That's his photon. And it cannot really be held too much against him. See, this is interesting because now we take this photon idea for granted, whereas back in the day, the contemporary scientists completely rejected it. Okay, so now you see how Einstein has created his new idea of space. Velocity is in meters per second, or space over time, and the space portion of velocity, which used to be filled with ether, in Einstein's world, he just got rid of it, and now it's empty space. He had to create the projectile photon light particle to go through empty space in order to explain how light works. So he's halfway there. He's taken care of space. Now he needs to take care of time. How is he going to justify that per second portion, or that time portion of velocity in relation to the ether? Einstein must get rid of this idea of a single universal-based clock.
Which, of course, is what he got rid of with special relativity and the objective frame of rest. There's no objective frame of rest in special relativity. So I know some of that stuff was a little bit mathy, but it'll come back. The formula that Einstein used, first off, they were just like with the Lorentz transformations. He took his equations from Max Planck, who was another famous scientist around that time. Before him, Henri Poincaré was doing a lot of relativism and relativity and creating, the thought behind it. And again, who knows if Einstein was an operative or, some sort of agent of some kind, or just one of these false prophets like many of other people that the devil used to basically deceive the world and confuse everybody. The point is that Einstein, first off, wasn't first to relativity. He wasn't the one that made relativity. He was riding on the coattails of other people, and he plagiarized their work. He took their work, he was propped up and put forward, and the devil was already bringing relativism to science before Einstein. But Einstein was kind of the chosen vehicle to market this idea. And of course, today you think, like he said, the narrative around Einstein's like this cult of personality, like, ooh, Einstein was such a genius and he just figured out all these things. Really, he's just a front man for a movement into relativism that the devil brought into this final leg of the journey of history to hide the truth of the earth, and as a result to make the spiritual conclusions of heliocentrism acceptable. And we'll get to those as well. In reality, Einstein was very confused. He is very self-contradictory. He copied a lot of people before him. He's typical false prophet that is raised up to you as a hero, but in reality is just an agent of the devil. All right, one more video to go, and then we'll wrap it all up. Let's see here.
Idea of a single universe.
Let's get you a little bit slower than 1.75. How about 1.5? Let's see.
Einstein must get rid of this idea of a single universal-based clock. And that's no easy task, because think about it. We live in a universe that has this forward arrow of time. Einstein needs that to go away and make our own personal clocks the only thing that matters. So how is he going to do this? And you guessed it. He is going to use Poincaré's idea of using light signals to create this synchronous time between two clocks. Now, these two clocks are separated by some amount of space.
Now, just a little quick note. This video does have a little bit of more science and math in it, but it has also some great visualizations like animations. If you feel overwhelmed by it, don't worry. We're going to try to make as much sense as we can out of it. I'm documenting all of these things for people who also maybe have some expertise bias that they need to get over. People who maybe have a physics background or who have an engineering background or a science background, and they need a little more information to understand why all of this is just bogus. So again, you don't have to feel that you have to understand all of these things, but you do need to focus so that you can see the devil's work in inversion in science. For the people that do have a science background, they need that extra documentation and proof. This is also for them. So anyway, but there's some great animations on these things too.
Pulse is then bounced back and forth between these two clocks, and that allows them to adjust to a common time between the two clocks. Now, it's very important to note that clocks that are adjusted this way need to be stationary. In Einstein's paper, he's going to start moving these targets and try to convince us that he has discovered something new in physics called relative simultaneity. And one last Poincaré reference, he wrote a paper called The Measure of Time, and this is the trick that Einstein is going to use. The idea of simultaneous events and how we measure them using time. So let's start digging into Einstein's paper and look at his light clock synchronization procedure. It is defined in section 1 of his paper and is similar to an 8th grade math word problem. Here he has a very simple definition of time, and it's the position of the hands on a watch. Now let's look at a simple animation that demonstrates this statement of synchronization of clocks, and we'll better understand what this equation means. We have two stationary clock towers, one at point A and another one at point B. At time TA, we're going to send a light pulse to the second clock tower. It arrives at the second clock tower at time TB. So the first half of the cycle is complete, and let's assume that it took 1 second. So the time it arrived at TB is 1 second. It started at TA at obviously 0 seconds. So we have 1 second total for the first half cycle. Now, the light pulse gets reflected from this clock tower at time TB. It arrives back at the origin at time T prime A. Now we have the full equation. The reflection back started at 1 second and arrived at the origin at 2 seconds. So we have 2 minus 1 is 1. 1 second equals 1 second, and we have synchronized clocks. But remember, this whole procedure of synchronizing the clocks and defining simultaneousness requires stationary clocks for the light pulse to bounce between. And again, with Poincaré, the timepieces are then adjusted. They mark the same hour at the same physical instant, but on one condition, which is that the two stations are fixed. Okay, I think I've made my point.
So even Poincaré was admitting that in order for these things to happen simultaneously and basically be synchronized, you have to have stationary frames of reference, which makes sense, right? The distance that the light travels this way and back, if these two things are stationary, is the same. That's a simple common sense observation.
Let's read this sentence, and it should match the animation we just went through. Let a ray of light start at the time TA from point A towards point B. Let it at the time TB be reflected at point B in the direction of point A, and arrive again at point A at the time T prime A. It's a very simple word problem, and it gives us this time interval and this time interval. If they're equal to each other, then we have this definition of synchronism. And these synchronous stationary clocks give us the definition of simultaneous. It's very important to understand the clock sync method because Einstein is going to use this to try to convince you that the moving clock is a real time and not just an apparent time. Now, before we leave section 1, let's take a closer look at this equation. Einstein creates a different form of the equation we just learned. This one is in distance, rate, and time. And this is the full cycle of the light bouncing back and forth. And down here, I have the same equation written as 2 half cycles. This half cycle format is what he uses in section 2. And it's still distance, rate, and time. This is the previous slide equation. And these time intervals are equivalent because we had the fixed clock tower distances and the fixed speed of light. Just for fun, let's see what this equation would look like if the speed of light was not constant. So we could just simply subtract a velocity from the speed of light, and on this first half cycle, the light pulse would just move slower. And then on the way back, we could add a velocity and it would come back faster. Then obviously time interval 1 would not equal time interval 2. Now where am I going with this? In section 2, he is using these two half-cycle equations. We have our time intervals, we have our fixed distances, but look at this. He is changing the rate or the speed of light.
This is the problem, and I'll just zoom in on it so you can see here. Not now. No, I don't want to enable diction. You can see here, C stands for the speed of light. And he's changing it in order to do this equation. But above, he just says the principle of constancy of the velocity of light. So again, contradictory math. It's just confusion.
So what the heck is Einstein doing here? He says, taking into consideration the principle of the constancy of the velocity of light, and then down here in each half cycle, he's changing the constant velocity of light. That's just too obvious of a mistake. There must be something more to the story about these distances and rates in these equations. So now we move on to section 2 and the rigid rod word problem. So now we have the stationary rigid rod, and it is going to move with velocity v along the x-axis. It's very simple. We basically took one of the clock towers and turned it horizontally, and then it's going to move in that direction. Now this should look very familiar to you. Let a ray of light depart from point A at time ta, let it be reflected at point B at time tb, and reach point A again at time t prime A. Now let's look at the animation. The velocity will be imparted to the rod and the light pulse will leave point A. Now we are at point B and it will get reflected back to point A. So with the velocity of light being constant, it's obvious that this time interval is going to take longer than this time interval. So it's no secret that these time intervals are not going to equal each other. That makes perfect sense because the only thing that's changed is the distances that we are measuring. So basically, Einstein is just moving those stationary clock towers. Since these time intervals do not equal each other, Einstein is then concluding that we cannot attach any absolute significance to the concept of simultaneity. Two events which are simultaneous can no longer be looked upon as simultaneous events from a system which is in motion. So do you really think that Einstein has discovered new physics that overturns the universal forward arrow of time just because of a distance change in a distance equals rate times time equation? We've got to dig into this a bit further. This little section is where Einstein is trying to prove that relative simultaneity is a real thing. And if Einstein is correct, then this is the exact spot where he gets to change the moving clock from an apparent time to another real true time. So back to this scenario, if we didn't stop the light pulse at rod point A, it's easy to see that we would have the light pulse going back to the origin. It would give us equal timing for each half cycle. So then why is Einstein stopping the light pulse right here and giving us a shortened time t prime A? Now I think we can see why the rate in these equations is not equal to the speed of light. RAB is the length of the moving rod, and it looks like the distance in these equations are equal because of that variable. So if we assume the constant speed of light in these equations, then the velocity term really represents a distance change. But there's no new scientific revelation here. If something is traveling at a constant speed, but it goes a different distance in one direction than the other direction, obviously the time intervals are going to be different. Let's look at more details within Einstein's word problem to see if we can figure out how he is convincing the world that the moving clock is a real clock. So now we will add clocks at the two ends of the rod, and they will be synchronized with the stationary system clocks. We will also add a moving observer with each clock. So these clocks on the moving rod are synchronous with the stationary clocks. But wait a second, we have moving clocks that are staying synchronous with stationary clocks. Moving clocks are supposed to slow in relativity, but these two moving clocks correspond at any instant to the time of the stationary system at the places where they happen to be. These moving clocks are therefore synchronous in the stationary system. That's pretty clear. These moving clocks do not slow. This to me sounds a lot like the moving time equals stationary time, which is the exact opposite of what Einstein relativity is about. So then we have the moving observers next to each clock. Then these observers apply the clock sync method from section 1 to synchronize these clocks. Now wait a second. We know that the section 1 method was designed for stationary clocks. When we apply it to moving clocks, it's obvious that it is going to desynchronize these clocks. And then we continue the word problem down to the equations. And then this is Einstein's big revelation. With the faulty method of trying to synchronize clocks on the move, we then cannot attach any absolute significance to the concept of simultaneity. Yeah, right. So here is a big contradiction in this paper. The observers in motion that are trying to synchronize their clocks will have this time interval not equal to this time interval. To illustrate this again, we have the light pulse from the first clock sent to the second clock. And this is the first time interval. And now it bounces back to the first clock. And then we have the second time interval. And these two intervals obviously do not match. But when we move into section 3, Einstein is going to derive the math for the theory. The moving system is called lowercase k, so let's take a look at what he does there. So from the moving system, lowercase k, and this part should look very familiar, a ray is emitted at time tau 0. Now tau is the moving clock, along the x-axis to x prime. He's using the origin, which would have been point A, and x prime, which would have been point B. And at the time tau 1, be reflected back to the origin, arriving at time tau 2. Same procedure, a little bit different form of an equation, and applied to the clocks of the moving system. So remember from section 1, we have this equation applied to a stationary system. And I just showed you from section 3 with the moving system lowercase k, we get this equation. These equations are equivalent. Let me show you.
The same equation being used to describe two contradictory things.
The subscripts are just changed, and T2 is there instead of T prime A. We just take this equation and quickly rebalance it. We add the T1 to both sides, and we get 2T1. We add T0 to both sides, and we get T2 plus T0. And then we divide out the 2 from both sides, and we get an equivalent equation just with some simple rearrangement. Now, he just got done telling us that the moving system will not have synchronized timing. This is what we just got done discussing. In section 2, observers in the moving system find that the two clocks don't run synchronously, and we get this time interval not equal to this time interval. But for some reason in this moving system, the time intervals equal each other. That's a blatant contradiction. Okay, so here we have Einstein playing both sides of the fence again. We have one thing, which is the moving system clocks, but getting two opposite answers: synchronization and desynchronization. Now let's go back and discuss Einstein's very important conclusion. His entire theory of relativity hinges upon this statement, but it's just not correct. So Einstein's purpose of this no absolute simultaneity, or relativity of simultaneity, is to convince you that both answers are correct. Even though the moving observer and the stationary observer have two different answers, his idea is that both answers are correct. This is what you will hear when you listen to people teaching Einstein's ideas.
So the big question is, who is right and who is wrong? And the answer is, they are both right.
No, they are not, and let me explain that to you. Here we are going to modify the moving rod scenario that you're already familiar with.
This will hopefully make everything make sense. I know there's been a little bit heady this one, but this is a good animation.
We have two light sources that will simultaneously flash. We are replacing the rod with a bomb. Instead of clocks on each end, we have these light-based triggers. If the light simultaneously hits these triggers, then the bomb will explode.
So you have a simultaneous event. The light has to hit them at the same time, same rate, same distance. So if they both hit at the same time, this thing is stationary. Then you get an objectively measurable result. The bomb explodes.
If we have a moving target, then the light will not hit the triggers simultaneously simply because of a distance change. Absolutely every time, the stationary system is going to see a simultaneous event occur. And absolutely every time, this moving bomb will never see those same two flashes as being simultaneous.
Because this one hits first, you see? If the bomb is moving towards this emitter, the distance is shortened. And so the light traveling towards the bomb is going to arrive there sooner, meaning it's going to hit this side first and this side second. So the trigger is not going to go off. The one standing still is going to experience a simultaneous event. They're two different results. One of them is exploding, one of them is not. They're not both true. Either it's exploding or not. That's the point.
So Einstein is trying to use this idea to convince you that both answers are correct, when in reality, the moving bomb always sees a non-simultaneous event because he doesn't explode. The moving bomb is just always wrong. Obviously, because the stationary bomb exploded, and it always explodes because of this simultaneous event. Let's apply this concept to physical reality. So from the previous video, this person can bet all day long that the source trumpet is making an F-sharp tone. He's just always wrong. I mean, sure, the F-sharp is actually what he is hearing, but we know exactly why it is, and it's because of the Doppler effect. Einstein wants you to believe that both of these answers are equally valid or equally correct. But in reality, one of these answers is always going to be actually physically incorrect about what the source is doing. So this is the real meaning behind this very important section of Einstein's paper. It's not that both answers are equally valid or equally correct, like he wants you to think, but rather one of these frames is just going to have an incorrect answer about what is actually going on at the source. Now, if you're still a believer in this idea of relative simultaneity,
Now, there's more here. You can check it out yourself with the spherical wave proof if you're into that or you want to get some more math about that. But basically, what's the point? Relative simultaneity is a philosophical conjecture. It's nonsense. Relativism is nonsense. Relativity is nonsense. Simultaneity happens because there is an absolute frame of rest somewhere. Something is at rest, objectively. Einstein's math is self-contradictory, and he contradicts himself many times. Because he's in one place he's saying one thing, in another place he's saying another, or he's using the same equation for two contradictory ideas. It's very clever gaslighting, but it's nonsense. And today you can see, like that clip of that guy from that physics seminar. Oh, the question is which one's wrong? Well, they're both true. How can you have both true? How can you be at a physics conference? I'm sure that guy's a doctorate in something. He's probably very educated, but obviously very indoctrinated. And this is the problem, folks. How can you say that they're both true? That's not how reality works. Relativity does not express reality. The only reason it, quote unquote, works in some sense is because it hijacked the wave equations of Schrodinger and Max Planck and so on and so forth. These people, Einstein basically hijacked wave equations and applied them to his nonsense. And remember, whenever there's two clocks that are both right, one of them is always canceled so that you can progress the equation forward. It's very clever, a lot of gaslighting, a lot of philosophical conjectures and math tricks and so on and so forth. Again, you don't have to understand all this stuff completely, but you hopefully can see the sneakiness and the absolute ridiculousness that this relativity concept has brought to the world. And of course, through that confusion, you have a lot of other things that came forward, like quantum nonsense, time travel, sci-fi, all the stuff that came as a result, and eventually the false signs and wonders of the false prophet, United States, in bringing people to believe that we live on a ball, through the moon landing, through the climate change agenda, which eventually is going to be roped into bringing people under the peace. So it all works together, folks. You have to see things as pieces to a satanic puzzle. And this is the crowning achievement of basically the 20th century, which is bringing relativism and eventually quantum nonsense into the fold, into people's minds. In reality, there's always one true frame of rest and one moving frame. This means that relativity doesn't actually work. It's not true. The way they solve their relativistic problems is by always canceling one frame and invalidating it through, various conjectures so that they can work with something. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do anything because, well, if everybody's true, then which one do you pick? You can't. You can't pick one over the other. On what basis do you pick one over the other if they're both true? This is just absolute nonsense. And thank God that we don't live in that kind of reality. I don't think such a reality could exist, because reality is based on God, who is objective, who is ultimate reality, who is objectively true. He's the standard, and everything is based that way. You have objective truth, and you have a standard, and you measure everything by that standard. If that's the truth, then the devil's desire is to invert that truth and say, no, everything is true, and you can determine the standard. And this is what he did to science through people like Einstein, and people before him too, like Henry Poincaré and Lorentz and all those people that were very relativistic. But either way, it's basically they just do unnecessary math to arrive at the same solution you would have with wave mechanics, but it's a way to obfuscate the truth with conjectures and mathematics and everything else. So putting it all together, I know that it was a little bit heady, maybe it was a little bit intense intellectually, but again, you don't have to know all this stuff. You just have to see that it's gaslighting and it's nonsense. 115 years later or so after Einstein has created this nonsense in the world, there has yet to be an experiment that proves that relativity is true. Don't let anybody convince you that relative simultaneity and all this stuff that we are talking about today is true. It's nonsense. And if they say you just don't understand it, then, well, yeah, I don't understand it because it's not true. It's confusing. It's contradictory. Einstein was propped up. He didn't really bring anything special to science. He just plagiarized everything from everybody else. And all he brought was relativity, meaning relativism. That's not an invention. That's a deception. All of our experiments always take a frame of rest and a moving frame. There's always a true answer and others that are not true. Whereas in relativity, even things that are contradictory are true, which is absolute nonsense. It is satanic. Einstein's equations were taken from other people before him, which were based on the wave theories. And he basically just inverted reality by getting rid of the ether and turning into space and turning light from a wave into a particle. And of course, you have to fill in the gaps of logic with math and all sorts of conjectures in order to make that work. And they use wave equations to this day, but nobody's the wiser. Einstein is always contradicting himself, as you hopefully have noticed. Again, you don't have to understand everything in those videos, but you can understand how he's contradicting himself. How in one place he says one thing, in another place he says another. And how people around him at the time, before the media machine turned him into this genius and oh, this and that, people were like, this is science fiction. What are you trying to do here, Einstein? And they didn't agree with his ideas. So the question is, why was relativity brought forward? In the very beginning of this section, we looked at all of these great minds that said that basically it doesn't matter whether the earth is moving or the heavens are moving. They're both the same thing mathematically. And we looked at the experimental evidence for the earth not moving. We looked at how confusing Einstein is and how confused he is. So the question is, why was relativity brought forward? Why is it so important to the devil? And of course, the question or the answer is that the relativistic mindset destroys the ether because, again, the experiments in the 1800s prove that the earth is motionless. There's objective proof that you don't live on a ball spinning around in space. That's number one. Number two is to create relativism and as a result, be able to make heliocentrism unfalsifiable, meaning it can't be proven false because there's no objective frame of reference. Do you understand the clever magic trick that they pulled with relativity? If there's no frame of reference and you just don't know if the earth is moving or if the heavens are moving, you have no way of knowing because they're both equally plausible, which they're not, then heliocentrism can always say, well, we are a valid explanation because you don't know what's moving and what's not. That's why heliocentrism is unfalsifiable. It's not unfalsifiable. It is falsifiable. It's very falsifiable. But through relativity, let me put it this way. If you believe in special relativity, if you believe in Einstein's ideas, then heliocentrism becomes unfalsifiable. Do you understand what I'm saying? Is that you cannot falsify heliocentrism if you believe in relativity. If you don't believe in relativity, which is the whole point of this and exposing the wickedness of this idea, then you realize that no, my senses aren't lying to me. The Bible isn't lying. Empirical evidence isn't lying. Everything tells me that there's an objective frame of rest, which is the earth. It's not moving. It's the heavens that are moving. Then obviously heliocentrism is very easy to falsify, and it's been falsified. But this is the point. Relativity was brought forward so that heliocentrism, at the peak of this conflict where evidence was surfacing like, hey, we're not moving, we're moving. The devil flipped it into this delusion so that going forward, heliocentrism could hide behind math and relativity and it couldn't be falsified. As long as people believed Einstein and the more he was propped up, the more cult of personality he was made. And no, he's an authority. Don't trust the science. Trust the science, folks. The more you trust the science, the more heliocentrism can hide and become unfalsifiable. Relativity brought atheistic science back into the mystery religion. And not immediately, but it set the stage for things like quantum, new age, time travel, science fiction stuff. All these things that basically are from Einstein's theories, which would eventually bring the atheistic science. Remember, science and spirituality were one and the same, just like the state and spirituality were one and the same. Those were separated by the beast so that ultimately it could be reintegrated and people would come back to the mystery religion. So Einstein's ideas, another reason they were put forward and propagated, was that they brought forward quantum and all this stuff you'll see in the next section, how all these things influenced the reintegration of science with spirituality. And of course, it's not true spirituality. It's the mystery religion of the ages that you can manifest your reality through consciousness and all this kind of stuff, which is basically just justifying witchcraft. That's why the next section is called quantum sorcery, because it's witchcraft. It's basically saying that you can do something and it's your consciousness that determines the result. It's not God who is the objective consciousness, who has predetermined all things for his glory and who's sovereign over time and space. No. It's you that's determining the outcome. Time is relative. There's no absolute frame of rest. Everything that God is about and that the Bible tells you about, they inverted and they justified it with math. It's an attack on God's sovereignty. Time travel, which of course is nonsense. There's one arrow of time moving forward. That's what your senses tell you. There's no such thing as time travel. But because of relativity and quantum mechanics, which are just both bogus, these ideas have filled people's minds and gaslit them into the idea that, well, there's multiple universes. You saw where those came from 1,000 years ago. And there's time travel and, all these different things, which what does that tell you? Well, ultimately, what it does is undermines God's sovereignty. Because God is sovereign over time, and we know that first and foremost through prophecies. There are over 1,000 prophecies. I think something like 1,300, 1,800 prophecies in the Bible. I forget how many, but there's certainly at least 300 having to do with Jesus that have been fulfilled. And other ones too that are historical and end times prophecies. So God has determined time, and there is a forward arrow, and he will accomplish all his purpose. That is what the Bible tells you. God is sovereign over time, and time reveals God's plan and his glory. But if time travel is possible and a multiple universe is possible, then eventually that's going to eat at your understanding of a sovereign God. Because if you believe Einstein, if you believe science is the authority who has placed itself between you and Christ, eventually you're going to believe that God isn't sovereign because there's multiple universes and, time, we could go back in time, we could do this and that, and well, maybe prophecies aren't really, maybe they're just not really true, and so on and so forth. Do you see the subtle attack that the enemy is waging through something like seemingly is scientific, but it's not. It's a spiritual paradigm. Relativity is a paradigm that is philosophical. It's not scientific whatsoever. It's dressed in a lot of science, as you saw. It's dressed in a lot of science, but it's nonsense. Multiverse, infinite possibilities, all these things tell you that God isn't sovereign to some degree or another, that he doesn't decree reality like he says in Isaiah 46, 8 through 11, that I declare the end from the beginning and I will accomplish all my purpose. There's no absolute frame of rest in relativity, which means that there's no objective standard. But God is the objective standard, and he created all things to reflect that, including the earth, as an unchanging foundation. The rock, which of course is a picture of the true rock that you can't see. Where God gives you an objective standard, Satan gives you relativism. Many don't realize that relativism is intertwined with the forbidden fruit of being your own God, and basically you know what's good from evil. Today, of course, relativism is all over the place, whether people realize it or not, because people have abandoned God's word. And they've abandoned sound thinking. You talk about the heliocentric model being ridiculous, and of course there's no empirical evidence for it, and people just harp on you and they attack you. It is you're stupid, you don't understand it, how could you make such a claim? Really? It's because I use my brain that I realize that something like Einstein's relativity is nonsense. It is garbage. It is poison, mental poison, because it's gaslighting you. And the moment you accept it and you accept their tricks, heliocentrism becomes unfalsifiable. And that's the point, because heliocentrism was getting falsified. And so they brought Einstein to the forefront and all these relativists. You don't have to have a science or physics degree or to be a nerd in these things to understand what Einstein did and what the devil did through Einstein. Einstein was a total fraud. He's very confused. probably a secret society member, probably a communist, probably channeling demonic ideas. Either way, he was a puppet of the enemy. It doesn't matter about his personal life. We've looked at several things that suggest all those things, but it doesn't matter in the end. The fruits are what tell you he was being puppeted by the enemy. Einstein brought relativism to science, and just like Eratosthenes and Cavendish and all these other figures in history that are propped up to you as, oh, these amazing minds, nobody questions it because the science is settled, quote unquote. The science is never settled, folks. One of the most scientific things that you can ever do is question the science, because science is an ongoing investigation. And anybody who tells you to just accept it without thinking, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, is basically gaslighting you into obedience and blind faith. Whereas God actually doesn't want you to have blind faith. He gives you evidence for things. He gives you plenty of evidence. That's why atheism is not a rational position. It's not about evidence. It's a emotional position because they don't want to submit to the evidence and they don't want to submit to God. But what these people do, they don't base even their views on evidence. They don't ask you to obey based on evidence. You see, again, the inversion? Everything, again, you will find this over and over again. That's why I say the devil is predictable. Whatever God does, the devil has to do it in an opposite way. God does not tell you to have blind faith. He asks you to have faith, but he gives you evidence for believing. Plenty of evidence. There's so much evidence to believe. The devil is peddling deceptions all the time. There's nothing true about what he does. He's the father of lies, right? And everything he says all the lies he says out of his own character. So there's no evidence for anything the devil asks you to believe. The devil asks you to believe based on no evidence, opposite of what God does. So he basically forces you into blind faith, whereas God empowers you into a conscious faith. Two different forms of faith. Today, people unfortunately have the former, which is the blind faith into obedience. Scientism. Trust the science. You got to just believe what the science authorities tell you. This is the religion. And that religion will become more and more moral as it gets subsumed by the beast and things all integrate back into a one world system. Relativity seems very complex and confusing, and in such a way so that you don't question it. And all these people who are doing physics, they can tell you you're just an idiot because you don't understand it. And the reality is, though, that it's nonsense. It's self-contradictory and it's gaslighting. So hopefully now you have a little bit of understanding about it. Again, you don't have to understand everything we covered in those videos, but you do see, hopefully, that Einstein was a fraud, that relativity is gaslighting, and that the devil was very active in the early 1900s to flip the narrative through science and through other means, obviously, to make heliocentrism unfalsifiable. But of course, now that we've debunked relativity, then you can see that heliocentrism is very falsifiable. Now, onward to part 6, quantum sorcery.